What's going on, guys, and welcome back to another tattoo video. And this one's going to be a bit different. Instead of doing a design, I wanted to show what I believe are probably the three most important shading techniques to learn, especially if you're starting out in tattooing. They'll be the most useful for you and will provide you with like really good contrast in your designs. Trying to utilize some of them in this piece. Actually I might have utilized all three of them in this piece if I remember correctly. But it's gonna be a lot simpler of a video. I want to try to explain like how I feel about doing each one and how to do each one, how it feels for me to do it and stuff. And hopefully you'll learn something. For this piece, I'm only using my 18 round liner to do the lining of these boxes and stuff, and using my 3 round liner and my 23 curved mag. And those are the only needles I'm using. In my opinion, the first one out of these three to learn to give your piece a level of depth and shade is going to be whip shading. So I'll show you how to do that one first and how I feel about it. So the best way for me that I feel to describe whip shading is essentially almost like a scooping motion. Like whenever I do whip shading, and like it varies in like how you're wanting to do it. So like if you can see, I go in with my needles and drag up and then out, up and then out, up and then out. So you go, when you start out, you try to go down into the depth you need to, and then as you're dragging along, you pull up. And the best way for me that, honestly, the way I kind of think about it is a little bit like skateboarding. When you try to kickflip, is you flick out, not like hard, but like just up and out. And when you're doing this, you'll see that the area, at least for me, how I do it is I'm a little bit slower at the beginning, and then I get a little bit faster as I whip out. And so where you start will be darker than where you're ending at. And in my opinion, it is fairly hard to mess up doing whip shading. Like, there might be like a little bit of problems with like keeping it all consistent, because even I have problems sometimes with that, where it's like I notice that some of my whip shading isn't as dark as other parts and stuff like that, but apart from that, like, it's fairly simple. In my opinion, it's probably one of the simplest. Like, these three are the simplest ones that I can think of. To me, probably the most difficult one to think about for me is pendulum shading. One thing I do like to do as well is, if I need to, do shorter little strokes like that to darken up where it's supposed to be darker. And That way it has a bit of a smoother transition from the dark up to the light. And honestly, in my opinion, stipple shading and whip shading are very similar in how you do them. So you'll essentially come out with something akin to that. Akin to something like that. Having a darker spot that transitions up to a light. And honestly, this probably is the one that takes the least amount of time to actually do as well, because with how wide a mag is, it doesn't take as much time to like lay it down into the piece. Obviously, depending on the size of the piece though as well. Now we're gonna move on to stipple shading, and this one is, like, I'm going in order of what I think is simplest to the least simple, and stipple shading definitely comes in a decent second for me, using my 3-round liner to do it. I always try to use whatever the smallest needle I have is for stipple shading, and it's hard to, a little bit of difficulty that comes with this is to actually get it to look like dots, essentially, because sometimes they just look like little lines, like very tiny lines, and the reason for that is matching the hand speed to when you're stippling out. And essentially for me it's similar to whip shading but not the same, where I try to keep a actual like decent flick motion instead of starting slow and then going out. It's starting in with it and flicking out with it. And for me, doing stipple shading, I like to lay down a base layer of dots, like this, essentially, before trying to go in and add in the darker shade for me, which will be like a little bit shorter strokes to get it down. But you can do it the opposite direction as well, where you can start out with a few smaller strokes and then go into the longer strokes to then essentially whip it out. Stipple shading for me, it might be the slowest one of them, if I had to say. Like, because obviously you're just trying to shade with a bunch of dots instead of like tight together like multi-needles, where you have to build it up more and more over time to do. But doing stipple shading definitely gives a very specific texture to things, which I think looks really good, which is why I do really enjoy trying to do stipple shading whenever I can. It's also just fun to do to me, and it's also, just like I feel like whip shading can be, it's not very, like, I think you have a, like, less chance of overworking the skin if you're stipple shading. I also will say that the way that I should be describing it, at least the way I do it, is that I should have told for whip shading, but for whip shading. As you can see, I do hold my machine a little bit at a further angle, about a 45-degree angle, for like going in and whipping out with it. Since I'm using a lining needle for this one, it's, to me, I feel I need to hold it a bit further up, like a bit more vertical, to get accurate little dots. Otherwise it'll go in a bit weirdly. But that is essentially how stipple shading works. I'll do a little bit more to darken it up a little bit. Like I said, I really just enjoy the textured look that stipple shading gives to materials. So pendulum shading is a bit different. It's, for me, it's a little bit harder to, not really understand, but to get consistent is, to me, it's the hardest one to get consistent, but essentially it is, as the name says, is you are, essentially, to show you simply, like, imagine this edge line right here is the skin you're going into. You essentially go in to where you need to, and then up, and up, and up, essentially as a pendulum does, like a pendulum swing does. To me, this is, in my opinion, the way pendulum shading works is it's more for specific moments that you need it for. Like, the one I could think of from here is this bit of shading underneath the eye, or next to the nose and between the nose and the eye, where there is no line that it's next to, that I generally use as a base for shading, is start at a line and go from there. There was no line for it, so to me, pendulum shading makes the most sense in that instance. But I'll show you a bit of what it looks like to do it. For pendulum shading, I do believe you should hold it a bit more vertically as well, and you just essentially go in. And essentially, it'll come out a bit like that. Like, for pendulum shading, the darkest part of the shade should be the center of it, which is why it can be a bit difficult, like, to do, like, because you can see where I'm doing it, even when I'm doing it, there's a bit of, like, darkness in the edge on this side rather than in the center, and that could just be the way I was doing it, but it gets a little bit, it just, to me, it's a little hard to get consistent, but that's why I don't use it very often. I think the main reason why I'm getting that edge right there is because of how I'm not pulling fully out of the skin when I'm pendulum shading. I'm essentially on that back swing back this way, I'm stopping in the skin and just leaving a little edge, and I think that's what's making it messed up. But if I gave my own personal opinion on it, I'm sure other people have different opinions, but in my opinion, I definitely, for one, I need to work on my pendulum shading more. That's obviously something that can be seen, but in my opinion, of these three to learn, I think in order as they are shown on screen are important to least important, which is whip shading is most important. Stipple shading can be very good to learn, but isn't the most important. And then pendulum shading, while useful, is not the most important one to learn. And if I was to suggest anything, I would suggest doing essentially what I'm doing right now. Like, if you can, like, it can be a hassle, say, if you are doing stencils freehanding or by hand onto paper, but if you're using a printer, then I would say do essentially this. Make a bunch of squares. Practice these shades. It'll be so useful to you as a tattoo artist. But that's essentially everything. I hope this video has helped you guys learn a little bit more about tattooing and a little bit about shades and different things you need to do, and I really hope you guys enjoyed watching. And if you guys have any requests or any questions, just ask them in the comments. And if you guys have liked, please like and subscribe. I know a large portion of the people who watch aren't subscribed to me, so please subscribe if you want to keep watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.